My sister pushed my daughter's face into her cake, laughing while she cried. My dad stood up, took off his ring, and slammed it on the table. The room went silent. What he said next changed everything. My name is Jolene. I am 34 years old. And the moment my older sister shoved my 10-year-old daughter's face into her birthday cake was the exact moment I lost my entire family. But before I tell you about the earth-shattering consequence that none of them saw coming, I want to take you back to that day. The day my life broke into pieces, quite literally and figuratively. It was Cleo's 10th birthday. For a single mother, your child hitting double digits is a massive milestone. Since my husband passed away 3 years ago, and we had to hold his funeral on a rainy Tuesday with barely enough money to cover the burial costs, Cleo has been my entire universe. She is the reason I drag myself out of bed at 5 in the morning every single day. She is the reason I put on heavy steel-toed boots and work 60-hour weeks at a dusty construction site, hauling heavy sheets of drywall and mixing thick cement just to keep a roof over our heads. It is backbreaking work, especially for a woman, but I do it without complaint because I have to. Cleo has a soul made of art and magic, just like her father did. She is absolutely obsessed with fairy tales. You know the ones, those stories where the good guys always win through hard work and the bad guys finally get what they deserve. So, for her big 1-0, I decided I had to do something incredibly special. I could not afford those fancy custom cakes from a boutique bakery downtown. They cost hundreds of dollars, and my weekly grocery budget barely covers the essentials. But I have steady hands. I also have a background in architecture that I never got to use professionally. I stayed up for 3 nights straight after working my construction shifts. While Cleo slept, I measured, I mixed, and I baked. I baked a vanilla bean sponge cake completely from scratch. I whipped up a fresh strawberry buttercream that made our tiny kitchen smell like the middle of summer. But the decoration, that was where I poured my entire heart and soul. I hand-sculpted tiny, delicate mushrooms out of sweet meringue. I spent hours spinning molten sugar into fragile, glass-like windows. I built a literal fairy cottage out of white chocolate right in the center of the top tier. When I finally finished it at 2 in the morning on the day of her party, it was not just a dessert. It was a promise. It was me telling my little girl, I know your dad is not here, and I know things are hard, but I will build magic for you with my bare hands. The party was held at my parents' house. My mother, Bernadette, had very reluctantly agreed to let us use their sprawling backyard. She always complained that my apartment was too cramped and, in her words, smelled like poverty, though she would never say it quite that directly. She just wanted to control the optics for the neighbors. I remember walking up their pristine driveway, carrying the heavy cake box, holding Cleo's hand. Cleo was wearing this pale blue dress we found at a thrift store. I had washed and ironed it until it looked brand new. She looked like a little angel. When I set the cake down on the patio table and opened the box, Cleo kept circling it, her eyes wide with absolute wonder. She looked up at me and said, "Mommy, this is the most beautiful thing in the world. I do not even want to eat it." I smoothed her hair back and told her that cakes are made to be eaten, sweetheart. But we had to wait for Aunt Loretta and Grandpa. And that is exactly where the trouble started. Loretta. My older sister. The golden child of the family. She arrived 2 hours late. Loretta is 38 years old, drives a luxury sports car that my father pays the lease on, and wears designer clothes she absolutely did not earn. Loretta has always been the main character of our family movie, while I was just the unpaid extra standing in the background. She has bankrupted 2 separate business ventures, yet my parents treat her like she is some kind of financial genius, funding her lavish lifestyle right out of their own retirement savings. When Loretta finally strutted into the backyard, the overwhelming smell of her expensive perfume could not hide the sharp stench of stale vodka. She was stumbling slightly, a crystal glass of clear liquor already in her hand. She laughed, her voice way too loud for the quiet family gathering, and said she was sorry but busy people cannot be tied to a clock. She looked down at Cleo and just said, "Happy birthday, kiddo." She did not even use her name. My dad, Harlan, sat at the head of the heavy glass patio table. He waved his hand dismissively at her tardiness. He told her it was fine, that she was here now, and told her to sit down because she works too hard. I gripped the edge of the patio table until my knuckles turned completely white. Work? Loretta had not worked a real, honest day in her entire adult life. But I swallowed my anger. I stayed quiet. I did it for Cleo. I forced a bright smile and announced it was time for candles. I lit the 10 small candles surrounding the chocolate fairy house. I told Cleo to make a wish. Cleo closed her eyes tight. Her small hands clasped together against her chest. The warm candlelight danced on her innocent, hopeful face. I knew exactly what she was wishing for. She was wishing her father could be there to see this. Just as Cleo took a deep breath to blow out the candles, Loretta stood up. She swayed dangerously, looming over the table and blocking the light. She stared down at the intricate fairy cottage I had spent 3 exhausting nights constructing. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger at the chocolate house and slurred, "What the hell is this? You made this, Jolene? God, it looks so pathetic. Real businesswomen build real companies. They do not sit around playing with sugar and crafts like children." I kept my voice low and steady. I told Loretta to shut up and let my daughter blow out her candles. Loretta sneered at me. She told me to lighten up, that she was just joking. She looked down at Cleo, and then back at the cake. I saw a cruel, intrusive thought cross her face, and her eyes suddenly glazed over with pure malice. Before my brain could even process what was happening, Loretta swung her arm down. She yelled, "Here, have a bite, princess." She grabbed the back of Cleo's neck and shoved her face violently down into the cake. The sound. That terrible sound still haunts my nightmares. It was not a soft splash of frosting. The structural chocolate shattered. The sugar glass window snapped. Cleo's face hit the dense sponge cake with a sickening thud. Cleo screamed. It was not a surprised laugh. It was a sharp shriek of pure terror and physical pain. Cleo flailed backward, lifting her head quickly. Her beautiful little face was completely covered in smashed pink cream and cake crumbs. But it was not just frosting. There was blood. A sharp shard of the hard sugar glass had sliced deep into her cheek, and the rich buttercream was pushed directly into her eyes. She was coughing, choking on the dense cake, and screaming for me. She was crying that her eyes were burning. Loretta just stood there. She threw her head back and laughed. A loud, braying, unapologetic laugh. She pointed at my bleeding daughter and yelled to look at her, that she looked like a clown, and yelled happy birthday again. A red mist descended over my vision. In that single second, I was no longer the submissive, quiet younger sister who kept the peace. I was a mother protecting her young. I launched myself entirely across the glass table. I shoved Loretta as hard as I possibly could right in the center of her chest. I screamed at her, asking if she was out of her mind. Loretta, drunk and completely off balance, tripped backward over a metal lawn chair and fell hard onto the grass. Her liquor glass went flying and shattered on the patio stones. Immediately, my mother Bernadette shrieked. She did not scream for Cleo. She screamed Loretta's name. My mother actually ran past her crying, bleeding 10-year-old granddaughter to kneel on the grass and help the 38-year-old woman up. She started frantically brushing non-existent dirt off Loretta's designer silk blouse, asking if she was okay. Not a single person, not even my father, looked at Cleo. I was on my knees on the hard stone patio, frantically using dry paper napkins to wipe the thick frosting out of Cleo's stinging eyes. My heart was physically breaking inside my chest as she sobbed violently into my shoulder, her small body shaking with shock. I turned my head to look at my father, Harlan. I desperately needed him to step in. I needed him to be the patriarch, the protector, to execute some basic level of justice. Harlan stood up slowly from his chair. He looked down at Loretta, who was faking a dramatic groan on the lawn. He looked at the ruined cake, the symbol of my love and exhaustion, utterly destroyed on the table. And then he looked at me. His eyes were cold. They were dead. He took off his heavy gold signet ring. It was the family ring he was so incredibly proud of. He held it in his fist and slammed it down onto the glass patio table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. The entire backyard went deathly silent. The only sound left was the quiet, ragged whimpering coming from Cleo. My father pointed a trembling, furious finger directly at me. For one split second, I foolishly thought he was going to defend us. He roared at me. He asked how I dared to put my hands on my sister over a stupid piece of cake. I completely froze. My brain could not compute the words coming out of his mouth. I stammered. I told him that she shoved Cleo's face into it. I told him there was glass sugar, that Cleo was bleeding and hurt. My father bellowed louder, his face turning a dark shade of purple. He said it was just a joke. He told me I have always been this way, too sensitive, too soft. He said Loretta is the eldest, and she was just trying to toughen Cleo up because she is too fragile. He screamed that I responded with violence against my own flesh and blood. My mother chimed in from the grass, her voice shrill and piercing. She agreed with him. She told me to look at Loretta's expensive blouse, that it had grass stains on it now. She said the cake was nothing, that I could just go home and bake another one. She ordered me to stop making a scene and ruining the family gathering. I stayed on my knees holding my daughter, and I looked at them. I really, truly looked at them for the first time in my life. These people were strangers to me. They did not care about Cleo. They never had. I stood up slowly, pulling Cleo up with me. My voice was shaking, not from sadness, but from a deep, volcanic rage I had suppressed for 3 decades. I asked them if they really called assaulting a child a joke. I told them Cleo is 10 years old, that she is bleeding and terrified, and they are only worried about a dry cleaning bill. My father straightened his posture. His voice dropped to a terrifyingly calm, absolute register. He stated clearly that if I do not know how to behave in this family, then I need to get out. He said he does not have a daughter who is petty, jealous, and disrespectful. He pointed toward the driveway and told me to walk out that gate and not come back until I was ready to get on my knees and apologize to my sister. I looked down at Cleo. She was gripping the fabric of my cheap shirt so tightly that her little knuckles were completely white. One of her eyes was already swelling shut from the irritation of the sugar and frosting. The cut on her cheek was still weeping blood. She whispered, "Let's go, Mommy, please, I just want to go home." I scooped Cleo up into my arms. I did not say another single word. I did not look back at my mother. I did not look at my father. And I definitely did not look at the smug smirk that was already creeping back onto Loretta's face as she dusted off her pants. I turned my back on all of them and walked straight out the heavy wooden gate into the gray, drizzling afternoon. I lost my family that day. But I promise you, and I mean this from the bottom of my heart, that was not the end. That was simply the origin story of my revenge. The drive away from my parents' wealthy, manicured neighborhood was a complete blur of rain and quiet tears. My old, rusty pickup truck rattled violently as we hit the potholes on the edge of town. The windshield wipers were fighting a losing battle against the sudden storm. Cleo sat in the passenger seat, buckled in, curled into a tight little ball against the door. I had used a bottle of water and an old napkin from the glove compartment to clean the rest of the sticky cream and blood off her face before we got in. But the smell of strawberry and vanilla still lingered. A smell that was supposed to be happy, a smell of celebration, now completely filled the cab of the truck with the overwhelming stench of humiliation and trauma. Her voice was so small, barely audible over the roaring engine and the rain hitting the metal roof. She asked me, "Mommy, is it my fault? Did I do something bad? Is that why Aunt Loretta did that to me?" That question felt like a physical blow to my stomach. It took all the air right out of my lungs. I gripped the steering wheel so hard the cheap plastic creaked under my hands. I looked over at her and said, "No, baby. You did absolutely nothing wrong. Aunt Loretta is a bully. And Grandpa and Grandma, they were completely wrong too." She sniffled, wiping her good eye. She pointed out that Grandpa told us to leave. She noticed that he never yells at Aunt Loretta, even when Loretta crashed his car last Christmas and lied about it. I bit my lower lip until I tasted iron. She noticed. Of course she noticed. Kids see absolutely everything. The unfairness was not some new development. It was the very foundation our entire family structure was built upon. As I kept driving through the rain, my mind was violently dragged back to the past. I remembered being 12 years old. Loretta was 16 at the time. She had been throwing a heavy baseball around inside the living room, despite our mother's strict rule against it. She missed a catch, and the baseball went straight through the glass door of my mother's antique china cabinet. When my dad got home and saw the shattered glass, Loretta did not even blink. She pointed a perfectly steady finger directly at me and said, "Jolene did it." I begged them to stop. I told them the truth. I tried to defend myself. I pleaded with them to believe me, but my dad just took off his leather belt. He did not punish me for the broken glass. He punished me for lying and for daring to blame my older sister. Loretta stood right at the top of the carpeted stairs, watching me take the punishment, grinning down at me like a shark. I was always the scapegoat. She was always the golden child. That was the unwritten, unbreakable contract of our household. As I got older, the stakes only got higher. It was not just about broken glass anymore. It became about my actual future. I was always the academic one. I loved school. I graduated high school with top honors and got accepted into a highly prestigious architecture program at a private university. I had massive dreams. I wanted to design buildings. I wanted to leave a permanent mark on the city skyline. But the very week before my university tuition deposit was due, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. My dad, Harlan, would not even look me in the eye. He folded his hands and said we needed to talk about my college fund. I smiled eagerly, telling him I had the housing deposit ready for my grueling summer job waitressing, and I just needed the tuition check we had been saving for since I was born. My mother, Bernadette, interrupted me while casually buttering her morning toast as if she were discussing the weather forecast. She told me the money was simply not there anymore. I asked what she meant. My dad cleared his throat, his voice firm, daring me to challenge his authority. He explained that Loretta needed capital for her new business venture. He told me she has a brilliant entrepreneurial spirit, that she was going to make this family millions of dollars. He looked me dead in the eye and said they had transferred my entire college fund into Loretta's business account. He said she needed it more right now. Then he looked at my hands. He told me I was good with my hands. He suggested I go to a local trade school instead. Be a mechanic or go into construction. He said it was honest work, and more importantly, it was cheaper. They stole my future. They took the money meant for my education to fund Loretta's first major failed business. It was a high-end, luxury wellness spa that permanently closed its doors in exactly 6 months because she spent the entire operating budget on lavish marketing parties and designer furniture, and completely forgot to actually hire qualified massage therapists. They clipped my wings so she could pretend to fly. And now, sitting in this cold truck, I realized they were trying to do the exact same thing to my daughter. They were actively teaching Cleo that her dignity, her physical safety, did not matter nearly as much as Loretta's fragile ego. I looked over at the passenger seat. Cleo had fallen asleep, completely exhausted by the emotional trauma and crying. Her cheek was puffy and red where the sugar glass had cut her. I whispered to the empty truck, "Never again." I pulled the heavy truck over to the shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching under the tires. I put it in park. My hands were shaking uncontrollably from the adrenaline, but my mind had never been more crystal clear in my entire life. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen lit up. 15 missed phone calls from my mother. 3 text messages from Loretta. I opened Loretta's text thread. The message read, "You are such a coward. Dad is absolutely furious with you. You better turn that garbage truck around and come apologize to him and to me right this second, or you can kiss your inheritance goodbye. Do not be an idiot, Jolene." Inheritance. Money. That was the heavy chain they always used to yank me back into line. They genuinely thought the vague promise of some future financial payout would make me swallow my pride and my self-respect forever. They thought I had a price. I typed out one single response. My thumbs hammered aggressively against the glass screen. I wrote, "Keep your money. I have something infinitely more valuable sitting in the passenger seat. We are done." I hit send. Then I immediately went into my contacts list. I blocked my mother's number. I blocked my father's number. I blocked Loretta. I blocked every single aunt, uncle, and cousin who stood there silently on that patio watching my daughter bleed without lifting a finger to help. I threw the phone onto the dusty dashboard. We had absolutely nowhere to go but back to our tiny, damp apartment. I did not know how I was going to explain this reality to Cleo when she woke up. I did not know if my hourly construction wages would be enough to get her braces next year, or pay for her to go to college one day. But as I pulled the truck back onto the wet highway, merging into the traffic, I felt something I had not felt in 34 years. I felt lighter. The crushing weight of their expectations, their constant cruelty, their endless gaslighting, it was entirely gone. I was poor. I was alone. But I was finally free. And I swore to myself right then and there that I was going to build a life so incredibly strong that they could never, ever knock it down again. The months that immediately followed that birthday party were, quite frankly, hell on earth. Cleo and I were living in a small basement apartment on the very edge of the industrial district in the city. When it rained, the walls smelled heavily of mildew, and the ancient radiator heater in the corner rattled like a dying car engine all night long. But it was ours. It was our safe sanctuary. To make up for the rent increase, and to start desperately rebuilding a new savings account for Cleo's future, I worked like an absolute machine. I stopped feeling like a human being and became a robot programmed to survive. My days started at 5 in the morning at the commercial construction site. I hauled heavy bags of concrete mix, I hung massive sheets of drywall, and I breathed in fine white dust until my lungs constantly burned. My back ached, my knees throbbed, and my hands were permanently calloused, but I could not stop. At 5 in the evening, I would clock out, rush across town to pick Cleo up from her free after-school program, feed her a quick dinner of boxed macaroni or sandwiches, help her with her math homework, and tuck her into bed with a story. Then, at exactly 8 o'clock at night, a kind elderly neighbor lady would come down to sit in our living room while Cleo slept. And I would leave for my second job. I got hired as a night shift dishwasher at Minerva's Patisserie. It was the most upscale, exclusive, ridiculously expensive bakery in the entire city. I was the invisible woman there. I stood at the very back of the bustling kitchen, submerged in steaming hot water. I spent hours aggressively scrubbing burnt caramel off heavy copper pans and scraping hardened dough out of massive industrial mixing bowls until my hands were raw, red, and blistered. But my eyes were always wide open, and I was always watching. From my station at the sinks, I watched the elite pastry chefs mix their delicate batters. I watched them temper shiny chocolate on marble slabs. And most importantly, I watched them completely fail at structure. The head pastry chef was a very arrogant man named Marco. Marco was an absolute genius when it came to flavor profiles. He could pair passion fruit and basil in a way that would make you cry. But Marco was an architectural disaster. He constantly tried to build these towering, elaborate wedding cakes, but he fundamentally did not understand basic physics. He did not understand load-bearing walls, tension, or the center of gravity. I would stand there scrubbing a pot, watching him stack heavy tiers of cake that were clearly unstable. He would use wooden dowels that were way too thin for the weight they were supporting. I would mutter to myself over the soapy water, "Gravity does not work like that, Marco. It is going to lean." But who was going to listen to the middle-aged woman washing the dishes? Nobody. Until one fateful Saturday morning. It was the absolute biggest, most important order of the entire year for the bakery. The city mayor's daughter was getting married that evening, and she had ordered a massive, 5-foot-tall replica of the Eiffel Tower, made entirely out of dark chocolate and sponge cake. It was a 5-figure contract. It was the kind of money that kept the bakery afloat for months. Disaster struck right at 9 in the morning. Marco, rushing across the kitchen holding a tray of sponge sugar, slipped on a freshly mopped spot on the floor. He went down hard, and we all heard the sickening crack. He broke his wrist in 2 places. He was screaming in pain and had to be rushed to the emergency room immediately. Absolute chaos erupted in the kitchen. The sous chefs were completely panicking. The delivery van was scheduled to arrive in exactly 3 hours. They frantically tried to assemble the massive tower based on Marco's messy sketches, but it kept leaning dangerously to the left. Every time they added a tier of cake, the chocolate girders at the bottom would start to buckle and snap under the immense weight. Minerva, the owner of the bakery, was a fierce, incredibly intimidating woman who rarely ever smiled. She wore sharp suits and demanded perfection. Right now, she was pacing the kitchen floor, her face pale, looking like she was about to have a literal heart attack. She muttered, wringing her hands together in despair. She kept repeating that they were ruined. She said the delivery van is here in 3 hours, and we absolutely cannot send this leaning pile of garbage to the mayor. She looked at the sous chefs and yelled that if they lose this contract, she will not be able to make payroll, and everyone's salary will be delayed. The entire kitchen went dead silent. The only sound was the humming of the massive refrigerators and the smell of panic mixed with melting chocolate. I was standing at the back sink, up to my elbows in greasy, soapy water. I looked past the chefs at the leaning chocolate tower. I analyzed it. I knew exactly why it was failing. The wide base was not properly reinforced. The internal load distribution was entirely wrong. The torque was snapping the outer beams because the inner core was hollow. I took a deep breath. I pulled my wet hands out of the sink and wiped them dry on my dirty, stained apron. I took a step forward into the center of the kitchen. I spoke up. My voice was a little raspy from lack of use in that kitchen. I said, "Miss Minerva." Every single head in the room snapped around to look at me. One of the arrogant sous chefs scoffed loudly. He waved his hand at me and said, "Get back to the sink, Jolene. We do not need clean dishes right now. We need a miracle." I completely ignored him. I kept my eyes locked straight on Minerva. I stepped closer to the table and said, "I can fix it." Minerva stopped pacing. She looked at me with deep skepticism. She looked down at my scuffed construction boots covered in cement dust. She looked at my rough, calloused hands and my wet apron. She narrowed her eyes and said, "You? You are the dishwasher, Jolene." I stood up perfectly straight. I spoke with a quiet, undeniable authority. I told her that before I was a dishwasher, I studied architecture. And right now, I work in commercial construction. I pointed at the leaning cake. I told her that her problem is not the chocolate. The problem is the physics. The internal supports are placed entirely wrong. The weight is snapping the beams. I looked at the clock on the wall. I told her to give me exactly 2 hours. I promised her I could re-engineer the internal frame using hard candy supports, redistribute the center of mass, and make it stand. Maybe it was absolute desperation. Maybe she saw the intense, burning fire in my eyes. Minerva hesitated for a long moment, the silence stretching out. Then, she gave a sharp nod. She pointed a finger at me and said, "If you ruin it completely, you are fired immediately. But since the cake is already dead, go ahead. Do it." I stepped up to the massive stainless steel prep table. I took a deep, centering breath. Suddenly, the warm bakery kitchen was not a kitchen anymore. In my mind, it transformed into a job site. The dark chocolate was no longer food, it was liquid concrete. The boiling sugar was structural glass. The cake layers were floors of a building. I worked with a level of intense focus I had not felt in years. I commanded the sous chefs to start melting down huge batches of hard clear candy. When it was molten, I poured it into molds to create rigid, structural I-beams. I used bowls of perfectly tempered chocolate as my welding material. I calculated the exact angles in my head. I used a serrated knife to shave precise millimeters off the sponge cake layers, adjusting the center of mass so the weight pressed straight down instead of leaning outward. My hands, though rough and blistered from carrying bricks and scrubbing pans, moved with a delicate precision and speed that surprised even me. I was completely in my element. I was building. Exactly 2 hours later, I stepped back. The Eiffel Tower stood in the center of the metal table. It was exactly 5 feet tall. It was perfectly straight. It was structurally sound. I had even taken a large brush and dusted the entire exterior with edible gold luster dust, so it caught the kitchen lights like the real monument catching the sunset in Paris. I wiped a layer of sweat from my forehead with the back of my wrist. The entire kitchen was dead silent again, but this time, it was a silence of absolute awe. Minerva walked slowly up to the table. She looked the tower up and down. She reached out one finger and firmly tapped one of the lower chocolate legs. It did not budge a single millimeter. It was as solid as a rock. She turned her head to look at me slowly. Her stern eyes were actually welling up with tears of relief. She whispered my name. She asked me how I did it. I gave a small, tired shrug. I told her I was just balancing the load, ma'am. Then, I turned around and started walking back to my pile of dirty dishes in the sink. I told her I needed to finish my shift. Minerva's voice cracked like a whip. She commanded me to stop. She walked over to me, grabbed my arm, and pulled me away from the sink. Her grip was incredibly strong. She looked me directly in the eyes and said, "You are never touching that sink again. You have hands of gold, Jolene. Do not ever waste them cleaning up other people's messes." She told me that starting the very next day, I was no longer a dishwasher. I was receiving a massive promotion. I was going to be her lead cake architect, and my salary was going to triple. That single day, that single moment of stepping up, changed the entire trajectory of my life. I was not just a tired construction worker anymore. I had found my true calling. They always say that success is the best revenge. I actually disagree with that statement. Success that nobody knows about is satisfying, sure. But success that you build quietly, brick by brick, in the shadows, while the people who bet against you are slowly crumbling, that is not just revenge. That is pure, undeniable justice. 5 entire years. That is exactly how long it took to transform Jolene, the exhausted, dust-covered construction worker and invisible dishwasher, into a complete ghost legend in the high-end culinary and event world. If you are a wealthy bride in the city with an absolutely unlimited budget, or a corporate chief executive officer planning a massive gala that needs to make the front page of the Sunday Times, you do not just call a regular bakery. You call Clio Structures. We do not have a flashy storefront on a busy street. We do not have a neon sign or a menu in a window. We operate entirely out of a beautifully converted industrial warehouse in the quiet arts district of the city. The space smells constantly of dark roasted espresso, melting chocolate, and clean drafting paper. You have to know someone who knows someone just to get the private email address to request a consultation. My team is incredibly small and tight-knit. It is just 4 of us. There is me, 2 brilliant sous chefs I personally poached from the best luxury hotels in the city by doubling their salary, and Vance. Vance is my young, sharp, and usually completely unflappable assistant who handles the intense business side of things so I can focus entirely on the architecture. It was a quiet Tuesday morning in late October. The studio was peaceful. I was standing high up on a metal ladder, working on a highly complex commission for a tech billionaire. He wanted a cake that completely defied gravity. He wanted a floating futuristic city, held up entirely by hidden magnetic levitation platforms and structural sugar glass. It was exactly the kind of intense engineering challenge that made my blood sing. I was carefully using silver tweezers to place a fragile sponge sugar spire onto a chocolate dome. Then, I heard the heavy studio door open. Vance walked into the main workspace. He looked hesitant, which was incredibly rare for him. He usually marched in with a clipboard and a list of demands. He cleared his throat softly and said, "Boss, you have a visitor out front. She did not have an appointment, and honestly, he looks terrible, but he says it is extremely urgent." I did not take my eyes off the sugar spire. I asked Vance who it was. Vance lowered his voice and said, "He says he is family. He says his name is Desmond." My hand completely froze in midair. I carefully set the sugar spire down on the silver tray next to me. I had not heard that word, family, spoken in relation to myself in this building in 5 entire years. I gripped the sides of the ladder. I felt a sudden cold chill crawl right up my neck. I looked down at Vance and told him that I do not have any family. Vance looked at me with deep sympathy. He said, "I know, Jolene. But he is crying in the lobby. Desmond. Loretta's husband." I slowly climbed down the ladder. I wiped the fine white powdered sugar dust from my hands onto a clean towel. I took a deep breath, smoothing down my tailored charcoal button-down shirt, and walked out into the front office reception area. Desmond was sitting on the edge of the sleek leather sofa, clutching a wet umbrella like it was a lifeline. He looked absolutely haunted. The Desmond I remembered from 5 years ago was a pristine, polished country club trophy husband who always wore pastel polo shirts and expensive watch brands. This man sitting in my lobby looked like a ghost. His designer tan coat was frayed at the cuffs. He had deep, dark purple bags under his bloodshot eyes, and he looked like he had not slept a full night in weeks. His hands were physically shaking as he held the umbrella. When he heard my footsteps, he stood up quickly. His eyes went wide as he took me in. I was not wearing a stained apron. I was not wearing cement-covered boots. I was wearing high-end tailored slacks and a silk shirt. I looked exactly like the chief executive officer I was, not the blue-collar failure my family always remembered me as. He breathed out my name, Jolene. He shook his head in disbelief and said, "My God, the rumors in the city were actually true. You really are the one behind Cleo's structures." I kept my physical distance. I stood behind one of the heavy leather chairs and did not offer him a seat. I kept my voice perfectly flat and professional. I said, "Hello, Desmond. Why are you here?" He blurted it out immediately, his voice cracking with desperation. He said, "I am leaving her, Jolene. I filed for divorce this morning. I took the kids and I left the house." I felt a tiny flicker of human sympathy in my chest, but I quickly stamped it out. I remembered how he stood on that patio 5 years ago, sipping a drink, watching my daughter bleed. I looked at him and said, "I am sorry to hear that your marriage is ending, Desmond. But I failed to see what your divorce has to do with me." Tears instantly spilled over his eyelashes. He took a step forward, his voice shaking with pure, unadulterated panic. He said, "She is going to absolutely destroy me in court, Jolene. Loretta is fighting for full, sole custody of the boys. And it is not because she actually loves them. She barely even knows their birthdays. She is fighting for custody so she can gain total control over my family trust fund. She hired the most expensive, ruthless lawyer in the state, and she is claiming to the judge that I am mentally unstable." I sighed heavily. I walked over to my heavy oak desk and reached for my checkbook. I told him I would not get involved in the drama, but for the sake of the nephews I used to know, I could write a check to help cover his lawyer fees. Desmond violently shook his head. He reached into his oversized leather tote bag and pulled out a massive, thick black binder. He slammed it down onto my pristine desk. It landed with a heavy, intimidating thud. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "I do not want your money, Jolene. I want you to bury her." I looked down at the black binder. It had a white printed label on the spine. It read, Harlan Construction Internal Ledgers, 2020 to 2025. I asked him what this was. Desmond leaned over the desk, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He called it the smoking gun. He asked me if I knew my father's construction company was in massive trouble. He said everyone in the industry knows they are hemorrhaging cash and are only weeks away from officially declaring bankruptcy. I gave a slow nod. I knew. I had been quietly watching their corporate stock valuation plummet for months. It was my secret morning ritual. I would drink my black coffee and read the financial pages, watching my father's beloved legacy slowly burn to the ground. Desmond's voice hardened with deep resentment. He said Loretta has been blaming the housing market. She blames the national economy, the local labor unions, the supply chain issues. But it is her, Jolene. It has always been her. I reached out and opened the heavy cover of the binder. It was a complete forensic accounting of the last 5 years of my father's business. My eyes quickly scanned the long columns of red numbers. It was an absolute financial slaughter. It was so much worse than I ever thought possible. There were massive monthly cash withdrawals disguised as consulting fees, all routed directly to offshore shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. There were hundreds of company credit card charges for luxury vacations to Las Vegas, expensive jewelry stores, and luxury sports car leases, all fraudulently marked as essential business expenses. I felt the realization settle deep into my gut like a block of cold lead. I looked up at Desmond and said, "She has been embezzling. She has been systematically stealing from our dad. Does he know?" Desmond let out a bitter, exhausted scoff. He said Harlan thinks Loretta is a misunderstood genius who is just having a temporary run of bad luck in a tough market. He explained that my dad actually signed over total power of attorney to Loretta 2 years ago after he suffered a mild stroke. He said my dad does not even look at the accounting books anymore. He blindly trusts his golden child. Desmond reached out a shaking finger and pointed to a final, highlighted figure at the absolute bottom of the last page. $4,200,000. Desmond's voice broke as he read the number out loud. He said that is exactly what she siphoned out of the accounts. He looked at me, his eyes full of terror. He told me that number includes the employee pension fund. It includes the entire equity of my parents' house. It is all completely gone. She gambled it all away on cryptocurrency, sports betting, and designer clothes. I slowly closed the binder. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but not with fear. It was beating with a strange, icy adrenaline. I asked Desmond why he brought this to me instead of the police. He wiped his face and explained that if he goes to the authorities, the corporate assets get frozen immediately by the government. The lawyers take years to sort it out in court, and the employees lose everything in the meantime. He said he needed her stopped right now, today. He leaned in closer, his eyes intense and desperate. He told me he knew exactly what they were doing tomorrow morning. He said they are desperately trying to sell the company. They are holding a massive meeting with a private equity firm called JC Holdings tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. They are desperate to sell a controlling interest to get a massive cash injection, just to cover up the payroll fraud before the external auditors arrive next week. I stayed completely silent. I just stared at the binder. Desmond repeated the name, JC Holdings. He looked around my beautiful, expensive studio. He looked at the architectural awards on the shelf. He looked at the framed silver photograph of Cleo and me sitting on my desk. He looked back at me and whispered, "Jolene and Cleo. It is you, isn't it? You are JC Holdings." I looked at him. I did not say yes. I did not say no. I simply picked up the sleek black phone on my desk and dialed Vance's extension. When he answered, my voice was perfectly steady, stripped of all emotion. I told Vance to immediately call our corporate legal team. I told him to tell them to fully prep the hostile acquisition papers for Harlan Construction. And I told him to inform the lawyers that I will be leading the negotiation meeting personally tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone and looked back at Desmond. I told him he would get his custody. I told him Loretta will not just lose her husband tomorrow. She is going to lose her entire kingdom. Desmond let out a loud, ragged sob of pure relief. He covered his face with his hands and wept right there in my office. That night, I did not sleep a single wink. I sat alone in my dark study, illuminated only by the small desk lamp, meticulously reading every single page of the evidence binder. I thought about the beautiful fairy house birthday cake. I thought about the sharp sound of my father's heavy gold ring slamming down onto the glass table. I thought about Cleo, sitting in the cold truck, crying and asking if she was a bad girl. I was not just preparing to buy a failing construction company. I was preparing to perform a family exorcism. The morning of the massive meeting arrived. The sky outside was a dark, bruised purple, heavy with the threat of a massive rainstorm. It felt incredibly fitting. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom. For 5 long years, I had dressed purely for comfort and physical utility. I wore boots, jeans, and aprons. Today, I dressed for absolute war. I put on a bespoke, 3-piece tailored suit in a deep, midnight navy blue. It was the kind of expensive fabric that seems to absorb the light around it. I fastened a heavy platinum Patek Philippe watch to my wrist, a watch that cost more than the entire house I grew up in. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight style, revealing the few strands of silver gray that had finally started to touch my temples. I did not look like the soft, quiet, submissive younger sister who used to take the blame for broken glass. I looked like a woman who signed checks that could buy and sell human souls. I heard a soft knock on the door frame. I turned around. Cleo was standing in the doorway of my bedroom. She was 15 years old now. She was tall, incredibly graceful, and wearing her neat private school uniform. She held a warm ceramic travel mug of black coffee in her hands. She looked me up and down. She smiled, but her eyes were deeply serious. She said, "You look really scary, Mom. Is today the day?" I walked over and took the warm coffee from her hands. I kissed her forehead and said, "Yes, sweetheart. Today is the day." She looked down at her shoes for a moment, then back up at me. She asked quietly, "Are you going to hurt them?" I shook my head slowly. I touched her cheek, right where the sugar glass had cut her 5 years ago. I told her no, I am not going to hurt them. I am just going to hold up a very clear mirror. Whatever ugly things they see reflected in it, that is entirely on them. Cleo wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me tight. She whispered in my ear, "Good luck, Mom. Make sure you get a receipt." I drove to the Harlan Construction headquarters completely alone. I did not want a driver. I wanted to feel the heavy leather steering wheel in my own hands. I wanted to feel every bump in the road. The corporate building was an absolute shadow of its former self. The exterior landscaping was totally dead, overgrown with brown weeds. The painted logo on the front sign was peeling and faded by the sun. As I walked into the main lobby, my expensive heels clicking loudly on the cheap tile floor, the young receptionist sitting at the desk did not even bother to look up from scrolling on her cell phone. I stopped at her desk and said, "I am here for the meeting regarding JC Holdings." She chewed her gum, pointed a lazy finger toward the back, and mumbled, "Boardroom, top floor, take the elevator." The elevator ride up to the executive floor was the absolute longest 30 seconds of my entire life. Every single floor indicator light that dinged felt like a ticking countdown clock to an explosion. Ding. The heavy metal doors slid open. I stepped out onto the thick carpet of the hallway. I could hear muffled voices arguing angrily from inside the main boardroom at the end of the hall. I heard my father's voice, sounding tired and deeply stressed. He was saying, "Stop pacing the floor, Loretta. They will be here. They have to be here." The lawyer's email said 9 o'clock sharp. Then, I heard Loretta's voice. It sounded whiny and completely arrogant, just like it always did. She complained loudly, saying she just does not like dealing with these shadow investors. She demanded to know why they would not send a real name, asking who this JC guy is anyway. My mother's shrill voice immediately chimed in. She said, "Who cares what his name is, Loretta? As long as his check clears the bank today. Just fix your collar, you look like you slept in a dumpster last night." I stopped right outside the double oak doors. I adjusted my jacket cuffs. I took one final, massive breath, filling my lungs with air. And then, I pushed both of the heavy oak doors open at the exact same time. The heavy wood swung inward with a loud, dramatic groan. 3 heads snapped toward the doorway instantly. The massive boardroom was incredibly dim, lit only by the gray, depressing morning light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The long mahogany conference table in the center of the room looked badly scarred and covered in a thin layer of dust. At the far end of the long table sat the absolute triumvirate of my childhood trauma: Harlan, Bernadette, and Loretta. For a solid 10 seconds, nobody in the room spoke a single word. They all just squinted at the doorway. The imposing silhouette of a powerful woman in a bespoke suit standing in the shadows simply did not compute with their deeply ingrained memory of Jolene, the family failure. Loretta was the first one to break the heavy silence. She did not recognize me at all. She threw her hands up in the air in an exaggerated motion of extreme annoyance. She huffed loudly and said, finally, "You must be the assistant rep from JC Holdings. You are late. We have a very tight schedule to keep today, sweetheart." I did not say a word. I stepped fully into the room. I walked slowly down the length of the table, the sharp heels of my Italian leather shoes clicking rhythmically on the parquet floor. Click. 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 I walked right past the rows of empty leather chairs. I walked right past Loretta, catching the distinct, familiar smell of stale vodka, heavy perfume, and cheap breath mints. I walked right past my mother, Bernadette, who was now staring openly at my expensive platinum watch with a deeply confused, pinched frown on her face. I walked straight to the absolute head of the table, taking the seat directly opposite my father. I pulled out the heavy leather executive chair, sat down smoothly, and placed Desmond's thick black binder flat onto the mahogany wood. Only then did I finally look up and make direct eye contact. My father was staring at my face. His mouth was slightly open. His tired, bloodshot eyes were darting frantically over my features, desperately trying to reconcile the image of the wealthy executive sitting across from him with his youngest daughter. He whispered my name. "Jolene?" It came out as a weak, terrified, cracking question. Loretta violently spun her chair around to face me. She squinted hard, her face twisting in confusion. Then, she let out a harsh, barking, incredibly ugly laugh. She slapped the table and yelled, "Holy crap! It really is Jolene." The brief shock on Loretta's face morphed instantly back into her comfortable, familiar mask of sneering, absolute contempt. It was a pure reflex for her to belittle me. She started clapping her hands slowly and sarcastically. She said, "Wow. Look at you playing dress up today. Did you finally get a job as a driver for the rich investors? Is that it? You were just here to fetch the coffee and donuts before the real businessmen show up?" My mother, finding her old, familiar rhythm of constantly scolding me, leaned forward. Her voice was sharp and cruel. She said, "Jolene, you absolutely cannot be in here right now. We are in the middle of a massive corporate crisis. We are waiting for the actual owners of JC Holdings. If they walk in and see you sitting there in that chair, honestly, do you have no shame at all?" I leaned back slowly into the plush leather chair. I casually rested my elbows on the armrests. I interlaced my fingers together and rested them on my stomach. I looked directly at my sister. I said, I am not the driver. My voice was incredibly calm. It was deep. It easily filled the massive room without me having to raise it even a fraction. I looked at my mother and added, and I am not late. It is exactly 9 o'clock. Loretta slammed her flat hand down onto the dusty table. She stood up, pointing a finger at the door. She yelled, "Get out right now. I am not in the mood for your pathetic little family reunion tour today." She looked toward the hallway and screamed for security. I smiled, a very small, cold smile. I said simply, "There is no security guard, Loretta. You fired him last Tuesday to save money to pay your personal credit card bill. Remember?" Loretta completely froze. Her mouth hung open. Her arm dropped slowly to her side. I turned my head and locked eyes directly with my father. I said, "And you can all stop waiting anxiously for JC Holdings to walk through that door." I paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the room. Then I said, "You are looking at her." My father gripped the edge of the table. He croaked out the letters. JC. I enunciated the words perfectly clearly. Jolene and Cleo. I tilted my head. I asked him, "Did you really think the initials were just a lucky coincidence, Dad?" My mother clutched the pearl necklace at her throat. Her face drained of all color until it was chalk white. She began to stammer uncontrollably. She said, that is completely impossible. You bake cakes. You live in a dirty basement. You do not have millions of dollars." I looked at her with eyes like pure ice. I said, "I have enough liquid capital right now to buy this entire building, burn it to the ground, and rebuild it from scratch just for fun." I kept my eyes locked on her and continued, "While your precious golden child was busy bankrupting your entire life's work, I was busy building an absolute empire. My weekly salary is not paid by Daddy anymore, Loretta. I sign my own checks now." Loretta's face turned a violent, ugly shade of dark red. She gripped the back of her chair. She yelled, "You are lying. You are completely bluffing. You probably rented that stupid suit. You are just here to gloat because you heard a rumor that we were having a rough patch." I raised one single eyebrow. I asked, "A rough patch? Is that what you are calling massive corporate fraud these days?" I reached out and placed my hand flat on the heavy black binder. I announced my terms. I said, "I am here today to make a formal offer. I will purchase 100% of the remaining assets of Harlan Construction. I will personally inject the massive capital needed today to save this entire company from total insolvency. I will ensure that the 200 innocent employees downstairs, people who actually work for a living unlike some people in this room, do not lose their jobs or their retirement pensions." My father's red eyes suddenly welled up with thick tears. For the very first time in my life, I saw him look at me with actual hope. He saw a massive, millions of dollars thick lifeline being thrown to him by the daughter he discarded. He reached a hand out toward me across the table. He cried, "Jolene, honey. I knew it. I always knew you cared deep down about our family legacy. We can fix this." I cut him off instantly. My voice sharpened into a literal knife blade. It sliced through the air in the room. I said, "There are strict conditions." My father nodded frantically. He sounded utterly desperate. He said, "Anything, Jolene. Anything you want." I sat forward in my chair. I looked at all three of them. I said, "Condition number 1. I want to talk about the cake." Loretta looked completely confused. She blinked hard. She asked, "What cake?" I stared right into her eyes. I said, "Cleo's 10th birthday cake. The one you violently destroyed. The one you laughed at while my child was bleeding from her face." Loretta groaned loudly and aggressively rolled her eyes to the ceiling. She threw her hands up again. She complained, "Oh, for God's sake. Are you seriously still harping on that ancient history? That was 5 entire years ago, Jolene. It was a joke. Get over it, you sensitive little. I did not let her finish the sentence. I stood up from my executive chair. I picked up the massive, heavy black binder of financial evidence. I walked slowly around the edge of the long table. I walked right up to where my father was sitting. I stood tall, looming directly over him. The entire room was holding its breath. If you've made it this far, please do me a favor, like the video and comment number 1 down below. It lets me know how awesome you are and shows that you're right here with me on this journey. Your support is a massive encouragement and truly motivates me. Drop that one so I can recognize you, and now, let's get back to my story. I leaned down close to my father's ear. I spoke softly, but my words carried the weight of a judge passing a final sentence. I asked him, "Do you remember that day? Do you remember when you took off your heavy gold ring? Do you remember how you slammed it down on the glass table and told me I was being petty? Do you remember looking at my bleeding 10-year-old daughter and telling me to get out of your house?" My father started to physically tremble in his chair. He shrank back away from me, whimpering quietly. He begged, "Jolene, please." I lifted the heavy black binder high above my head with both hands. I looked right at him. I whispered, "This is my ring." I brought the binder down and slammed it onto the mahogany table with every single ounce of physical strength I had in my entire body. The sound was absolutely deafening. It sounded like a bomb going off in the closed room. The impact was so incredibly violent that a massive crack actually splintered down the center of the wooden table. My mother screamed out loud, covering her ears. Loretta physically jumped backward, her chair scraping loudly against the wood floor. I roared at the top of my lungs. I pointed at the binder and screamed, "Read it." My father, now shaking like a leaf in a hurricane, reached out with trembling hands. He slowly flipped open the heavy cover of the binder. He looked down at the first page of the ledgers. He gasped, his breath catching in his throat. He looked up at me in terror and asked, "What is this?" I pointed a stiff, accusing finger directly across the room at Loretta. I said, "That binder is the absolute, undeniable proof that your precious golden child is nothing but a common thief." I commanded my father to look at page 10. I told him to look at the massive offshore withdrawals. My father's terrified eyes scanned the long columns of numbers. He started to read the items out loud, his voice breaking with every word. $300,000 wired to a shell company. $50,000 charged for a luxury boat rental. I stood over him and delivered the final blow mercilessly. I said, "She stole absolutely all of it, Dad. The college trust funds you set up for her own children? Gone. Your entire life savings and retirement accounts? Completely gone. The monthly mortgage payments for the house you live in? She embezzled every single penny." I looked at him and said, "She did not just fail at business, Dad. She robbed you completely blind while smiling in your face." My father slowly lifted his head and looked across the cracked table at his eldest daughter. The look of profound, absolute betrayal in his eyes was staggering. It was the look of a man whose entire universe had just collapsed inward. He whispered her name. Loretta. He begged her to tell him this was not true. Loretta was physically backing away toward the wall, her face as pale as a ghost. She held her hands up defensively. She started stammering out pathetic excuses. She said, "Dad, please listen to me. It is incredibly complicated. The market was so tough. I just borrowed the money temporarily. I swear I was going to pay it all back as soon as the investments hit." My father suddenly exploded. He pushed his chair back violently, stood up, and grabbed Loretta by the lapels of her expensive silk blouse. He screamed in her face, saliva flying from his lips. He roared, "You stole my entire life. I trusted you with everything. I gave you absolutely everything. I did not let the chaos continue." I slammed my hand on the table. I commanded in a voice of absolute authority, "Sit down." Both of you. They both completely froze. The sheer power in my voice was undeniable. They slowly released each other and sat back down in their chairs, looking at me like terrified children waiting for the principal. I smoothed the front of my tailored jacket. I walked back to the head of the table. I looked at the three of them. I laid out the final terms of their surrender. I said, "Here is the offer. I will buy the company today. But the current board of directors is completely dissolved effective immediately. You, Dad. You, Mom. And especially you, Loretta. You are all officially fired. Today. Right this exact second." The heavy silence that followed my ultimatum was suffocating. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. It was the distinct sound of three separate worlds ending all at the exact same time. Loretta was the very first one to completely break. The arrogant sneer, the entitled golden child persona, the superiority, it all evaporated into thin air. What was left standing there was a terrified, pathetic, empty shell of a human being. She did not just stand up and beg. She actually fell hard onto her knees. She crawled around the edge of the long table toward me, her expensive designer pants sliding on the dusty floor. She reached out and tried to grab my hand. She blubbered, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. She cried, "Jolene, Jolene, please. You cannot do this to me. Desmond, he filed for divorce this morning." I pulled my hand away from her in absolute disgust. She kept crying. She said, "Desmond knows all about the missing money. If I lose this high-paying job, if I lose the legal protection of this company's lawyers, he will give this evidence to the police. He will send me to federal prison, Jolene. Oh my God, I am going to prison. Please, you have to think about my kids. Your nephews." I looked down at her groveling on the floor. I searched deep inside my heart. I really, truly tried to find even a single shred of pity or forgiveness for her. But all my mind could conjure was the vivid image of Cleo's tiny face covered in pink frosting, her eyes swollen completely shut, bleeding from broken sugar glass. I looked at my sister. My voice was deadly calm, completely void of emotion. I asked her, "Your kids? You mean the innocent kids whose college funds you literally snorted up your nose and gambled away at blackjack tables in Las Vegas?" I leaned down closer to her. I said, "I am thinking about them, Loretta. That is exactly why I am taking this company away from you today. To make absolutely sure there is at least some money left over to pay for their extensive therapy bills after you go away." She wailed loudly, clutching desperately at the fabric of my pant leg. She cried, "We are sisters, Jolene. Blood is thicker than water. You have to help me." I stepped back, forcing her to let go. I pointed a finger at her and said, "Stop. Do not ever use that word with me again. You permanently stopped being my sister the exact day you decided that my 10-year-old daughter's physical pain was your personal entertainment." From the other end of the table, my mother finally started to cry. It was that specific, weaponized, professional victim crying that she had meticulously perfected over 40 years of manipulating people. She sobbed loudly, holding a tissue to her face. She cried, "Jolene, how can you be so incredibly cold to us? We are your parents. We gave you your life. We put a roof over your head for years. You cannot just fire us from our own business. You cannot kick us out. What will the neighbors say? How will we survive? What are we supposed to do for money?" I turned my head and looked at her. I felt absolutely nothing. I said, "You will survive, Mom. Just like I survived when you threw me out. You still have a house. Well, actually, the bank owns the vast majority of it now, thanks to your precious Loretta. But if you sell it very quickly, you might walk away with just enough cash to rent a small, one-bedroom apartment somewhere quiet." I paused, and then added with a perfectly straight face, "Maybe you can finally get a real job. I hear the local grocery store is hiring friendly greeters at the front door. My mother gasped dramatically. She clutched her chest as if I had physically shot her with a gun. She cried out, "A job? I am 62 years old, Jolene. I cannot work on my feet." I looked at her coldly. I reminded her, "I was 29 years old when you threw me out onto the rainy street with a child to feed. I worked 3 backbreaking jobs just to survive. You can handle one." My father had not spoken a single word since he finished reading the ledger. He was completely slumped over in his large leather chair, staring blankly down at the cracked wood of the table. He looked like a man who had just fully realized that his entire existence, his entire family dynamic, was built on a massive lie. He slowly lifted his heavy head and looked up at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot and hollow. He whispered, his voice cracking, "I made a terrible mistake." I looked at him and said, "You made a lot of terrible mistakes, Harlan." He slowly shook his head side to side. He said, "No. I mean, I bet on the completely wrong horse. I thought Loretta was the strong one. I thought she was the winner. I always thought you were weak and too soft. But I was so completely wrong." He gestured weakly around the room. He said, You are the one who actually built something real. You are the exact man I always wanted my son to be." He reached out a trembling, old hand across the table toward me. He pleaded with me. He said, "Jolene, daughter, can we please try to fix this? I want to know my granddaughter. I want to see Cleo grow up. Please." For one tiny second. Just a microscopic split second, I felt a familiar tug in my chest. It was the ghost of the little girl inside me who just desperately wanted her daddy to be proud of her. That little girl wanted to reach out, take his hand, and say yes. But then, my mind flashed through the reality of the last 5 years. I remembered every single birthday he never called for. I remembered every Christmas morning he ignored. I remembered every single time Cleo cried in her bed, asking me why her grandpa did not love her enough to visit. I looked at his outstretched hand. I said firmly, "No." My father physically flinched backward as if I had struck him. I told him the absolute truth. I said, "Cleo is incredibly happy. She is kind, she is brilliantly smart, and most importantly, she is safe. And she is going to stay completely safe because you and your toxicity are never going to be allowed in her life ever again." I turned my head and signaled to Vance, who had been standing completely silently like a statue by the boardroom door the entire time. Vance stepped forward, opened his leather briefcase, and placed 3 thick termination contracts and the massive corporate purchase agreement down onto the center of the table. I stood up straight and buttoned the center button of my suit jacket. I laid out the final reality. I said, "Here is the deal. You sign every single one of these papers right now. I officially take over the company. I will personally pay off the massive, immediate debts so the federal authorities do not arrest you for corporate fraud before dinner time today. But you walk away from this building with absolutely nothing. There is no golden parachute severance package. There is no company car. You get nothing." Loretta, still sitting on the floor, wiped her running nose with the back of her hand. She looked up at me with venom in her eyes and asked, "And what happens if we refuse to sign your stupid papers?" I looked down at her. I said, "Then I turn around, I walk out that heavy door, and I immediately call the federal auditors and the Internal Revenue Service while I am riding the elevator down to the lobby. And by dinner time tonight, this entire building will be seized by the government, and you, Loretta, will be wearing silver handcuffs." The expensive ink pen violently shook in my father's old hand, but he was not stupid. He knew it was completely over. He reached out and signed the papers. My mother signed her papers next, weeping loudly and dramatically the entire time. Loretta finally pulled herself up from the floor. She sat in the chair, staring blankly at the wood, and aggressively signed her name to her own destruction. I calmly picked up the thick stack of papers. I meticulously checked every single signature. Everything was perfectly in order. I looked at the heavy Patek watch on my wrist. I looked at the three of them and said, "You have exactly 1 hour. Take your personal items only. My new security team will be escorting you out of the building." I turned on my heel, the click of my shoes sounding like a gavel dropping, and began walking toward the heavy oak doors. Just as I reached the handle, my father called out into the quiet room. His voice completely broke. He cried, "Jolene, I love you." I paused with my hand on the brass door handle. I did not turn around to look at him. I could not bear to see his face. I stared at the wood grain of the door and simply said, "I know you do. But you loved her more. And that terrible choice has a very high price." I pushed the heavy doors open and walked out of the boardroom. I walked down the long hallway. I walked right past the receptionist in the lobby. I walked out the front doors into the pouring rain, but I did not feel cold at all. I felt a massive, glowing warmth spreading rapidly through my chest. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and dialed Cleo's number. She answered on the very first ring. Her young voice was breathless. She asked, "Mom? Is it done?" I let out a massive, shuddering breath. I felt like I had been physically holding that breath in my lungs for 5 entire years. I smiled into the phone. I said, "It is done, baby. It is finally done." She asked softly, "Are you okay?" I tilted my head back, looking up at the dark gray sky, which was just beginning to break open with tiny rays of sunshine. I said, "Yeah. I am way better than okay. I am finally free. Turn the big oven on, kiddo. I am coming home to bake." It has been exactly 365 days since I walked out of that depressing boardroom into the rain. One full, glorious year since I finally cut the cancerous tumor out of my life. People who know my story often ask me if I regret doing it. They ask if I ever miss my parents or my sister. In the dramatic movies, this is always the part where the protagonist stands staring out a rainy window, swirling a glass of expensive whiskey, feeling a deep, aching void inside their heart where their family used to be. But let me tell you, this is not a movie. This is my actual life. And the absolute truth is, I do not feel a void at all. I feel immense, overwhelming relief. It is exactly like when a low-level, incredibly annoying humming noise that has been constantly playing in the background of your life for 30 years suddenly stops. And you finally, truly realize what actual, peaceful silence sounds like. It sounds like absolute peace. I kept my word to the employees. I bought the company assets, legally renamed it Cleo's Sustainable Living, and completely gutted the toxic, lazy culture my sister had installed. I tracked down and rehired the honest foreman Loretta had fired for pointing out her mistakes. I instituted a generous profit-sharing model for all the construction workers. It turns out, surprisingly enough, when you treat hardworking people with basic human dignity rather than treating them like disposable servants, business absolutely booms. We are currently projected to completely double our profit margins by the end of this financial quarter. But that is just the business side. The real, meaningful victory was what happened at home. I have not spoken a single word to my parents or to Loretta since that day in the boardroom. I permanently blocked their phone numbers, their email addresses, and even their social media accounts. However, Desmond, Loretta's ex-husband, occasionally gives me brief updates when we meet downtown for coffee. The fallout for my family was incredibly swift and absolutely brutal. Without the endless company credit cards and the massive siphon of embezzled funds, Loretta's fake luxury lifestyle collapsed within a matter of weeks. Desmond told me she desperately tried to keep up appearances for a little while, going to the country club and putting rounds of expensive drinks on personal credit cards that were already maxed out to the limit. But harsh reality eventually came loudly knocking on her door. Loretta is currently living in a tiny, depressing studio apartment situated directly above a noisy mechanic's garage in the absolute worst part of town. She works long hours doing commission sales at a shady used car dealership off the highway. Apparently, she constantly tells anyone unfortunate enough to listen to her that she was the innocent victim of a highly illegal, hostile corporate takeover orchestrated by a jealous, vindictive younger sister. Desmond said she still insists on wearing her old, outdated designer silk blouses to the car lot, even though they are stained and fraying heavily at the seams. She is a delusional queen without a kingdom, bitterly ruling over a cracked asphalt parking lot full of rusted, overpriced sedans. As for my parents, they were forced to sell the big, beautiful family house. They absolutely had to, just to pay off the massive mountain of hidden debt Loretta had secretly saddled them with. After the bank took their massive cut, there was barely anything left. They had to move into a tiny, cramped two-bedroom condo unit in a very basic retirement community about an hour outside the city. It is a clean enough place, but it is incredibly small. There is no grand, sweeping backyard patio to host fancy parties. There is no social status to lord over the wealthy neighbors. It is just two tired, old people sitting in a small living room, staring at the walls, constantly wondering where it all went so terribly wrong. I sometimes wonder if they finally blame Loretta for ruining their lives. Desmond says they do complain about her in hushed, angry tones. But old, toxic habits die incredibly hard. My mother, Bernadette, reportedly still drives an hour every single weekend to bring Loretta homemade casseroles and do her laundry for her. She is still actively enabling her golden child, even as Loretta drags all three of them down into the mud. Some generational cycles are simply unbreakable, unless you are the one brave enough to completely step out of the spinning wheel. I chose to step out, and I have never looked back. Just last week, I met Desmond at a sunny park downtown. His brutal divorce was finally finalized, and he honestly looked 5 years younger. The deep stress lines around his eyes had completely smoothed out, and he was smiling again. He handed me a warm cup of coffee and told me that Loretta finally signed the legal papers. He said he won full, sole custody of the boys. He explained that the judge only granted Loretta supervised visitation rights twice a month. But honestly, Desmond said, she rarely ever actually shows up to see her own kids. She always calls and makes up excuses, claiming her highly important business schedule at the used car lot is just too busy. I laughed into my coffee cup. I told him that selling used Honda Civics is not exactly Wall Street. He smiled and shook his head. Then he looked at me seriously and said, "Thank you, Jolene. Thank you for absolutely everything. That massive binder of forensic accounting evidence you gave my lawyer, it completely saved us in court." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. I handed it across the table to him. I told him I had something for him, or rather, something for the boys. Desmond looked confused. He opened the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. It was a fully funded trust fund document. He quickly scanned the pages, his eyes going incredibly wide. He looked up at me, shocked, and said, "Jolene, this amount of money. I absolutely cannot accept this from you." I held up my hand firmly. I told him it is not for him. I said it is specifically for my nephews. I explained that it is a locked, irrevocable trust fund solely for their future college education. I told him that Loretta stole their entire future to pay for her selfish mistakes and gambling addictions, so I am simply giving their future back to them. I pointed to a specific clause on the second page. I told him there is a very strict, unbreakable legal clause written into the trust. I said Loretta cannot ever touch a single, solitary cent of that money. Not for management fees, not for investment purposes, absolutely nothing. I said the money goes directly to the university billing departments, or it goes directly to the boys when they turn 25 years old. Desmond started to openly cry right there in the middle of the sunny park, surrounded by people walking their dogs. He wiped his eyes and asked me, "Why? Why would you do this for them after absolutely everything she did to you and Cleo?" I looked past him, watching a group of young kids playing happily on the swing set nearby. I told him, because they are just innocent children, Desmond. I was the family scapegoat, and Loretta was the golden child. And look at how incredibly messed up and broken both of us turned out to be because of it. I looked back at him and said, I want to completely break the cycle of abuse. I want your boys to grow up knowing that someone in this family actually has their back, even if their own mother does not care about them. Walking away from that park, doing that one simple act of kindness, felt so much better than any petty revenge I could have ever exacted on Loretta personally. I learned a very valuable lesson that year. The absolute best, most devastating revenge against a true narcissist is not to actively try and hurt them. It is simply to render them completely and utterly irrelevant to your life, while you wildly succeed and use your success to help the innocent people they neglected and abused. But the absolute, undisputed highlight of my entire year was not the booming business, and it was not the charity. It was yesterday. Yesterday, Cleo turned 16 years old. In our culture, the Sweet 16 is a massive rite of passage. It signifies the beautiful transition from childhood into young womanhood. But for Cleo and me, this specific birthday carried an incredibly heavy emotional weight. It was the exact anniversary of the disaster. 6 years ago, her 10th birthday was the absolute worst, most traumatic day of her entire life. I was fiercely determined to make this birthday the absolute best day she had ever experienced. We did not invite a single blood relative. We did not invite aunts, uncles, or cousins. Instead, we invited her true, chosen family. We invited her incredibly supportive friends from the high school art club. We invited the loyal staff from the bakery and the studio who had watched her grow up and treated her like a daughter. We invited Desmond and her 2 young cousins. And, of course, we invited Vance. I rented out the massive, stunning rooftop garden of the city's modern art museum. It was a perfectly clear, crisp autumn evening. The city skyline sparkled all around us. We spent hours stringing thousands of tiny, glowing fairy lights completely across the wooden pergola, so it looked exactly like we were standing inside a sparkling galaxy of stars. A smooth jazz quartet played soft, beautiful music in the corner of the roof. And then, there was the cake. I had spent an entire week meticulously designing and building it in secret. I did not want to build a fragile fairy tale castle this time. Castles are for fake fairy tales, and Cleo and I were living in reality. A beautiful, hard-earned, solid reality. The cake was an absolute masterpiece of modern structural architecture. It consisted of 4 massive tiers, completely suspended in midair by a complex, hidden internal cantilever system I engineered myself. The tiers genuinely appeared to be magically floating, completely unconnected to each other. The outside of the cake was decorated with hand-painted, completely edible watercolor fondant panels that seamlessly depicted the night sky. The colors transitioned beautifully from a deep, dusky purple at the wide-bottom tier, all the way up to a brilliant, star-filled midnight black at the very top. And in the absolute center of the cake, resting on the top tier, instead of a fragile sugar glass house that could be easily broken, I placed a single, perfect, incredibly realistic sugar glass lotus flower. I chose the lotus very specifically. The lotus flower grows in the absolute darkest, dirtiest mud, but it pushes its way up, rising above the messy surface to finally bloom into something remarkably beautiful and completely untouched by the dirt below. It was the perfect, shining symbol of my daughter's resilience. When I slowly wheeled the massive cake out onto the rooftop, the joyful chatter of the party completely stopped. The guests literally gasped out loud. But I was not looking at the cake, and I was not looking at the guests. I was only looking directly at Cleo. She was wearing a stunning, shimmering silver dress that caught the fairy lights perfectly. She looked so grown up, looking more like her late father than I had ever seen her. She covered her mouth with both of her hands. Her eyes were wide, but they were not filled with the sheer terror of suffocating frosting and broken glass like they were 6 years ago. They were completely filled with bright tears of pure, unadulterated joy. She stepped closer to the cart. She whispered in absolute awe, "Mom. It is literally floating." I stepped up and stood right beside her, putting my arm around her shoulder. I smiled and said, "It is floating. Make a wish, sweetheart." Cleo looked at the magnificent cake. Then, she turned her head and looked at me. She looked around the glowing rooftop at the diverse group of friends and chosen family surrounding her. People who loved her exactly for who she was, not for what she could provide for them or how she made them look to the neighbors. She smiled, a massive, glowing smile. Her voice was incredibly strong and perfectly clear as she spoke to the crowd. She said, "I do not need to wish for anything at all. I already have absolutely everything I could ever want." She leaned forward and blew out all 16 silver candles in one big breath. The entire crowd erupted into loud cheers and applause. It was perfect. There was no drunk, bitter aunt there to cruelly ruin the moment. There was no highly critical, image-obsessed grandmother there to complain and wipe invisible dust off an expensive suit. There was no father slamming a ring on a table to demand submission. There was just love. Completely safe, warm, unconditional love. Much later that night, after the music stopped and the party was finally winding down, Cleo and I sat together on the very edge of the high roof. We sat side by side, dangling our feet over the edge, looking out over the endless sea of glittering city lights below us. We were quietly eating thick slices of the floating cake on simple paper plates, enjoying the cool breeze. Cleo licked a smudge of dark blue frosting off her silver fork. She looked over at me and said, "Hey Mom?" I took a bite of cake and asked, "Yeah, kiddo?" She paused for a moment, kicking her feet slightly. Then she asked, "Do you ever think about them?" She did not have to specify who them was. I knew exactly who she meant. I stopped chewing. I took a long moment to really think about my answer. I wanted to be totally honest with her. I swallowed the cake and said, "Sometimes. Sometimes I think about how incredibly sad their lives are. They had absolutely everything a person could want. They had a family that truly loved them. They had plenty of money. They had their health. And they threw absolutely all of it away into the garbage because they just could not stop bitterly competing with each other and trying to tear me down." Cleo leaned her head over and rested it gently on my shoulder. She sighed and said, "I am so glad you finally got us out of there, Mom. I remember being so incredibly scared all the time whenever we had to go to Grandma's house. I always felt like I had to act perfectly quiet and be invisible, or else they would not like me." I wrapped my arm around her waist and kissed the top of her head. I told her firmly, "You never, ever have to be perfect for me, Cleo. You just have to be exactly who you are." She nodded thoughtfully. She looked out at the city skyline and said, "You know, Aunt Loretta used to always say you were a failure because you just liked baking silly cakes. She said you would never be a real success like her." I let out a genuine, loud laugh that echoed on the roof. I said, "She certainly did say that a lot." Cleo lifted her hand and gestured broadly out to the illuminated skyline. She pointed toward the distant crane lights where my company was currently building 3 massive, sustainable housing projects for the city. Then she pointed down at the empty cake plate. She smiled a wicked little smile and said, "Well, she sells rusted used cars in a dirty parking lot, and you built a magically floating cake and bought her entire company out from under her. So, I guess she was completely wrong about what actually makes a person a success." I felt a massive, thick lump form in the back of my throat. I looked at my brilliant, beautiful daughter. I told her, "True strength is never about how loud you can yell at people, or how hard you can hit them when they are down. True strength is about what beautiful things you can manage to build from the broken wreckage they leave behind. Strength is quietly protecting the people you love." Right at that moment, my cell phone buzzed loudly in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen. It was a blocked phone number. But my phone automatically transcribed the voicemail message and popped the text up onto the screen. It was from my mother, Bernadette. The transcription read, "Jolene, it is your mother. It is Cleo's birthday today, isn't it? I wanted to call and say we really miss you. Your father is not doing very well lately. His blood pressure is way up again. Loretta is constantly asking us for money we do not have. We are just so incredibly tired, Jolene. Please, please call us back. We are family. I read the desperate text on the screen. I looked over at Cleo, sitting happily and completely safely resting on my shoulder. I looked back down at the screen one final time. Cleo noticed me looking at the phone. She asked casually, "Who is it, Mom?" I pressed the delete button. I watched the message permanently disappear from my phone. I looked at my daughter, smiled warmly, and said, "Nobody important." I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I did not feel any lingering guilt. I just felt a quiet, profound confirmation deep in my soul that I had absolutely made the right choice 6 years ago. I stood up and stretched my back. I asked her, "Are you ready to go home?" Cleo stood up, grabbed her shoes, and smiled brightly. She said, "Yeah. Let's go home." We drove back to our house with the truck windows rolled all the way down, letting the cool, crisp night air completely fill the car. As I navigated the quiet, empty streets of the city, a city whose skyline I now actually helped shape and build, I started deeply thinking about the toxic psychological concept of the golden child. For so many years of my life, I deeply envied Loretta. I desperately wanted to be her. I wanted the easy praise, the completely paved path, the blind, unconditional approval of our parents. I genuinely thought she was the lucky one. But looking back at it all now, from this side of the mountain, I realized that being the golden child was actually a horrific curse expertly disguised as a blessing. Because Loretta was never once held accountable for her bad actions, she never learned how to grow as a person. Because she was constantly rescued from every single mistake she made, she never learned how to swim on her own. My parents did not raise a strong leader. They raised an emotional cripple. They permanently stunted her growth with their endless enablement, just as effectively as if they had taken a hammer and broken her legs. And being the family scapegoat? Being the one who was constantly blamed for everything, ignored, and violently pushed aside? It was incredibly painful. It left deep psychological scars that I will absolutely carry with me for the rest of my life. But those ugly scars are also my strongest armor. The severe neglect forced me to become fiercely independent. The constant, harsh criticism forced me to become a meticulous perfectionist in my work. The total lack of financial and emotional support forced me to learn how to build my very own solid foundation from the ground up. I am the successful, strong woman I am today precisely because of the terrible things they did to me. Not in spite of them. They aggressively tried to bury me in the dirt, but they were too stupid to realize that I was a seed. I know there are thousands of you amazing women watching this video or listening to my voice right now who feel exactly like I did for 30 years. Maybe you are the designated black sheep of your family. Maybe you have a golden brother or a perfect sister who can do absolutely no wrong in your parents' eyes, while you are harshly criticized for simply breathing too loud. Maybe you are painfully holding on to a highly toxic relationship right now because society has always drilled it into your head that blood is thicker than water. Listen to me very carefully. Let me tell you a secret that took me 34 painful years to finally learn. The full, original historical quote is actually, "The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb." Do you know what that actually means? It means that the beautiful, strong bonds you actively choose to make, with your loyal friends, with your supportive partners, with the people who actually show up for you when you are crying, those chosen bonds are infinitely stronger and more valuable than the random bonds of biology. Sharing DNA with someone is just a random lottery ticket. It absolutely does not give anyone the right to mentally or physically abuse you. It does not give your parents or your siblings a lifetime VIP pass to blatantly disrespect your personal boundaries or to hurt your innocent children. I used to be so terrified. I used to think that cutting my family off would literally kill me. I thought I would wither away and die of sheer loneliness. But the exact opposite happened. I came completely alive. I look at my amazing life now. I have Cleo, who is rapidly growing into a compassionate, brilliant, completely fearless young woman. I have a highly successful business that I built with my own two blistered hands, completely based on honesty, integrity, and grueling hard work. I have chosen friends who would drop absolutely everything and drive across town to help me if I called them crying at 3 in the morning. I do not have a perfect, fake family portrait to hang on the mantle over the fireplace. But I have absolute, unshakable peace when I lay my head down on my pillow every single night. If you are sitting there right now, exhausting yourself waiting for a genuine apology that is never, ever going to come, please, stop waiting. If you are desperately trying to buy your family's love with your constant silence and your painful compliance, stop paying the toll. If you are letting toxic people hurt you over and over again simply because you are terrified of being alone in the world, let me promise you this: being completely alone is 1,000 times better than being surrounded by people who constantly make you feel lonely and worthless. Loretta is still out there somewhere today, standing in the rain at a used car lot, probably loudly blaming me for every single misfortune in her life. My parents are still out there in their tiny condo, desperately waiting for me to come crawling back to fix the massive financial mess they created. But I am never coming back. I have incredible cakes to bake. I have beautiful buildings to design. And I have a wonderful daughter to love. My name is Jolene. I was the family scapegoat who finally became the architect of her own destiny. And if I can manage to rebuild my entire life from the sticky, bloody rubble of a smashed birthday cake, then please believe me when I say this, you can absolutely rebuild yours too. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. It was not an easy thing to sit down and share with the internet, but I truly hope it helps even one person out there realize that you always have the power to simply walk away from abuse. You hold the pen to write your own ending. Please take care of yourselves, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.